All right, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Sunday service. My name is Thomas. I'm part of the pastoral staff here. If this is your first time, hope you can make it to the welcoming lunch. Would love to get to know you and introduce our church to you. Also looking forward to all of you who are joining the course today. We'll be meeting again. Just grab your lunch, go straight to the classroom. And congratulations, Laker Nation. This is a great, beautiful Sunday morning that we all awoke to. So just know it's a good trade. Don't doubt it. It's a great trade. This is your first time here. We've been actually announcing this for the past few weeks, but today is the beginning of a new sermon series that we're going to be doing. It's a 12-week series on the book of Numbers. I'm not sure if you guys ever read through the book of Numbers, or if you read it, if you remember it, or if you remember it, if you even enjoyed it. And a big question that maybe we should ask is, why is our church dedicating the next 3 months to this book called Numbers? Well, a couple of reasons I want to give just to kind of orient us is, one, if you've been with our church the past few years, we've been going through a series, every time we go through a book, over what's called as the Torah. We believe the Bible is an epic story, and there are different stories within that Bible. Think Star Wars. There are different series within a larger grand narrative. The Torah is almost like the prequels. These are the first 5 books that collectively unite to make one story together. Genesis is the first story in the Torah. Exodus is the most well-known story. Even if you didn't grow up in the church, you're just familiar with the Exodus story. Leviticus, we went through that in the summer, if you guys remember that. The least read book probably in the Bible that we try to go through and understand. Numbers, I would argue, maybe not the least read, but probably the least understood story in the Torah. If you ever read through it, it's kind of hard to make sense of. And the reason why it's hard to make sense of is it's really confusing, the structure of it. It's kind of boring at times, and it's also really weird. Like when you read the book of Numbers, a lot of it in the beginning, it's actually filled with a lot of like lists. There are stories in there, but there's also like a lot of poetry. There's a lot of laws. That's why a lot of churches that preach through Numbers, they only preach through the story part because it's hard to make sense of all the boring parts that are in that book. It's really repetitive if you read Numbers. You're kind of like, man, we've been here before. Like Israel's grumbling, and it seems like God gets mad. Israel's grumbling. It's just recycling over and over again these similar stories. The stories themselves are wild. Like there's a story where Israel is rebelling, so God sends snakes, and these snakes bite the Israelites. You're like, what is going on? There's a story where these leaders are rebelling, so the ground opens up and swallows them into the ground, and you're like, what in the world? There's a talking donkey. You guys ever heard about that before? Yeah, it's in the book of Numbers. Really weird stories. And of course, the main reason why it's tough to read, there's a lot of numbers in the book of Numbers. A bunch of lists with a bunch of numerical digits just kind of everywhere there. So it's a tough read for a lot of people, even for people who call themselves followers of Christ. And yet, why are we going through this? I would argue the book of Numbers, it's extremely important because the book of Numbers, what happens in this story, we're told in the New Testament, this is actually meant for us. This serves as instruction for God's people today. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1-4, this is the Apostle Paul. He says it like this. He's talking about, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were under the cloud, passed through the sea, and were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. He's talking about the Israelites in the book of Numbers here. And then he says, but now these things happen to them as an example, but they are written down for our instruction. In other words, what I'd argue is more than any other book in the Torah, more than any other book that's the first 5 books, the story of Numbers reflects our story. It's meant to be a template that we are supposed to look to and that we are meant to relate to as well. And so to begin this, we're going to look at Numbers chapter 1-2. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Numbers chapter 1. We'll be looking at the first 5 verses, and then we'll be skipping over to chapter 2 and reading all the way up to verse 34. And if you have your programs, it should be there as well. And here at our church, we believe when we read the scriptures, our God is alive. So can we all rise as we read from Numbers chapter 1 and chapter 2. Starting verse 1, chapter 1. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the 2nd month, in the 2nd year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, take a census of all the congregation of the people of Israel, by clans, by fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male head by head. From 20 years old and upward, all in Israel who are able to go to war, you and Aaron shall list them company by company. And there shall be with you a man from each tribe, each man being the head of the house of his fathers. And these are the names of the men who shall assist you. Now let's jump over to chapter 2, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, the people of Israel shall camp each by his own standard with the banners of their fathers' houses. They shall camp facing the tent of meeting on every side. Those to the camp on the east side toward the sunrise shall be the standard of the camp of Judah by their companies, the chief of the people of Judah being Nahshon, the son of Amminadab. His company is being listed as 74,600. Those that camp next to him shall be the tribe of Issachar, the chief of the people of Issachar, being the Daniel, the son of Zuar. His company is being listed 54,400. Then the tribe of Zebulun, the chief of the priests of Zebulun being Eliab, the son of Helon, his company being listed 57,400. All those listed at the camp of Judah by their companies were 186,400. They shall set out on the first march. On the south side shall be under the standard of the camp of Reuben by their companies. The chief of the people of Reuben being Eluzur, the son of Shadur, his company is being listed 46,500. And those that camp next to him shall be the tribe of Simeon. The chief of the people of Simeon being Shemuel, the son of Zerushadai, his company is being listed 59,300. Then the tribe of Gad, the chief of the people of Gad being Elisaphat, the son of Reuel, his company is listed being 45,650. All those listed at the camp of Reuben by their companies were 151,450. They shall set out second. Then the tent of meeting shall set out, with the camp of the Levites in the midst of the camps. As they camp, so they shall set out, each in position, standard by standard. On the west side shall be the standard of the camp of Ephraim by their companies. The chief of the people of Ephraim being Elishama, the son of Ammihud, the company of his listed being 40,500. And next to him shall be the tribe of Manasseh, the chief of the people of Manasseh being Gamaliel, the son of Pedazur, his company being listed 32,200. Then the tribe of Benjamin, the chief of the people of Benjamin being Abidan, the son of Gideoni, his company being listed as 35,400. All those listed at the camp of Ephraim by their companies were 108,100. They shall set out third on the march. On the north side shall be the standard of the camp of Dan by their companies. The chief of the people of Dan being Ahiezer, the son of Ammishaddai, his company being listed 62,700. And those of the camp next to him shall be the tribe of Asher, the chief of the people of Asher being Pagiel, the son of Okran. His company shall be listed 41,500. Then the tribe of Naphtali, the chief of the people of Naphtali being Ahira, the son of Anan. His company is being listed 53,400. All those listed at the camp of Dan were 157,600. They shall set out last, standard by standard. These are the people of Israel as listed by their fathers' houses. All those listed in the camps by their companies were 603,550. Let's stop there. This is Book of Numbers. I warned you. Let's all pray. Father in heaven, as we begin this series, we may look at this and wonder what is going on here and how is this relevant to anything we're going through today. Speak a word to us today. Minister to our souls. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be seated. This upcoming spring, some of you know, my family and I, we are planning a trip to Korea and Japan. This is my first time in Japan and the first time in 20 years since I've been to Korea. And a lot of people are saying, dude, you're going to love it. It's going to be so much fun. We're taking our kids with us. So it's going to be a little bit different than maybe what a lot of us experienced. We have 3 young kids that we're traveling with, and we need to figure out, what's the best way to navigate. We can't just wing it. We have to know, what do we do? How do we best travel Korea, Japan as a family? And so we research a lot. We Google, TripAdvisor, ChatGPT, write us an itinerary and all that. But by far, the most helpful resource for us to know how do we navigate through Korea, Japan is by talking to you guys. Those of you who have been to Korea, who have been to Japan, especially families. When you guys have already gone and you tell us what it's like, it's so helpful because families who've been there, they let us know what their personal experience was like, what's worth visiting, what's worth not visiting, what's overhyped, what's something that's really good to eat, what's something that's actually not that great to eat. It's great hearing the stories that people go through, and that kind of just sets us up to have a better idea of, okay, this is how Korea, Japan might be like. So all you families, if you've been there, DM me, send us whatever you can. It's super helpful. And the reason why I bring that up is because this is the reason why the New Testament authors, why they always look back at the story of Numbers and says, look back at this. This is for your instruction. This is for something that we are meant to look at as a paradigm of how we navigate life. And to provide some context for us, remember the story of Numbers, it's part of a bigger story called the Torah. And it begins the story in Egypt, where we saw this in the series of Exodus, where Egypt, they were enslaved for 400 years as slaves, and then God rescued them. And then they actually went to Sinai. And so Exodus, all the way to Leviticus, and all the way to the first 10 chapters of Numbers, they are camped at Sinai, receiving the law, receiving instruction for the tabernacle, the priesthood, and so forth. And then what we're going to see, though, is that the Israelites, they're going to go to the plains of Moab. And that's going to be the last section of Numbers, because they're going to go to the Promised Land. And the plains of Moab is like right at that border, right before the Promised Land is there. But between that, what's going to happen is the Israelites, they're going to travel through the wilderness. And that is the majority of the book of Numbers, chapters 11 all the way to chapter 21. And what's interesting when you see this in context is that at Sinai, they spent about a year there. So Exodus all the way to Leviticus to begin in Numbers, that's about 11 months. The plains of Moab, they're there for about 7 months camping out. The wilderness, the journey itself to get there, this is going to take 38 years. 38 years of the Israelites spending time through the wilderness. That's why even though our English Bibles, it's titled Numbers because of all the numbers in the book, particularly there's 2 censuses, one that's in chapter 1, one in chapter 26. But the Hebrew Bible, the original title, it's actually not Numbers. The Hebrew title is Bemidbar, which is the Hebrew word for in the wilderness. It's all about life, journeying through the wilderness. Why is there so much emphasis on the wilderness? Why is there so much time and a whole story dedicated to Israel traveling through the wilderness for 38 years? Dr. Carmen Imes, she's a professor at Talbot. She actually says the wilderness, it's not just a place, but it functions as a type of space. She calls it liminal space. Some of you guys have ever heard that term before. But liminal space is, you could almost define it as a transitional state between 2 places. So when you're waiting in line for something, you're not where you were, but you're not at the destination yet. That's a liminal space. Or when you're at the airport, you're not in OC, but you're also not outside of OC, so you're kind of in this liminal waiting period. Or when you're pregnant. You have a child, and yet the child isn't out yet. You're in this weird liminal space that's taking place. And what Carmen Imes says is this is actually what the Israelites are in right now. The book of Numbers takes place between their redemption in Egypt. They're not slaves. And yet they're also not in the Promised Land. They're in this liminal space, this space of in-between. And what's going to happen in Numbers is Israel has to learn, as you navigate through this liminal space, what do you need most? What's going to help you as you travel these 38 years? Not how to find food, not skills for hunting or defending yourself, not even a map. What Israel needs to learn most is to navigate through this liminal space. You have to learn to trust in Yahweh, to trust in God, and what that even looks like. And so Numbers is all about teaching the Israelites how they can learn to trust Yahweh as they navigate through the wilderness. And that's why Numbers, you could argue, reflects our story. We are all navigating in liminal space. For those of us who profess we follow Jesus, we have been redeemed through Jesus' death on the cross. And we await a new creation, but until then, there's this kind of liminal, in-between space that's there. And for a lot of us, this is why life is hard. You're kind of in the wilderness. And in the wilderness, it's easy to get lost. It's easy to get discouraged. It's easy to lose your footing and know where you're going. And that's where, in this time, what we need most is not what the world tells us we need. But we need what Numbers tells us, which is we need to learn to trust Yahweh. Are you trusting Yahweh in the midst of your journey in life? Is he there in the liminal space for you as your anchor? Now, why should we trust Yahweh? How do we grow in trusting God? And what does this specifically look like? Numbers 1 to 2 sets us off, teaching us 3 things. Number 1, to trust Yahweh, you must first remember the plan of God in your life. Secondly, you must centralize the place of God in your life. And then lastly, you must follow the path of God. So remember the plan of God, centralize the place of God, follow the path of God. Let's talk about first the plan. Numbers chapter 1. So Israel, they're at Mount Sinai, camped there for a year, getting ready to go to the Promised Land, going to go through the wilderness. But before anything, Yahweh says, wait, you must first take what's called a census. Look at chapters 1, verses 1 to 3 with me one more time. The Lord, this is Yahweh, he spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in a tent of meeting on the first day of the second month, in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, take a census of all the congregation of the people of Israel by clans, by fathers' houses, according to the number of names. And so what happens is, count all the people, 1, 2, 3, 4, count all the men who are in this room, and what you can do is record it, and you get the rest of Numbers, this long list of different names. I spared y'all. Like, you thought we read a lot? Like, there is so much more. Like, this is what it looks like. This is chapter 1. It's just this long list of different names. It's the same repetition. Only thing that's different are the names and the numbers. And I get it. When we read this, we're like, oh my gosh, like, this is in the Bible? Like, no wonder people don't read their Bibles. It's so boring. Our eyes glaze. And I totally get it. I understand, because we think, like, how does this have any meaning to me? Why does the Bible have all these names and numbers? What's the point of it? And I pushed back a little bit, going, the only reason why we don't care about the names and numbers is because we don't understand the significance of them. Because just know, when you think about it, you read names and numbers all the time with great interest. For example, for some of us, this might be interesting to you. Oh, you see some of us go, I look at that every day. Laker fans, doesn't get very interesting this week, right? Names and numbers, that's all it is. Or if you don't watch sports, maybe this might be interesting to you. Oh, that's interesting. Names and numbers. Thousands of years from now, people will look back at our civilization going, what is this? This is so boring. You know, all of us like, oh, this is very interesting, actually. Because we know there is meaning and there is significance behind all of this. In a similar way, that's what's going on in Numbers. It's boring to us because we don't know the meaning and significance of these names and these numbers. So what is the significance? Why do these names and numbers matter? Well, there's a couple of things that Yahweh is trying to show us. Two things let me highlight. One thing that Yahweh is trying to show us is when you look at the names and numbers, notice the growth of these populations. If you notice that these names and numbers, he lists the tribes, and these populations that are there, it is astronomical. Like that many people in each tribe. Scholars, in fact, look at this going, this can't be real. Like, this is way too big. Because when you count them, the Israelites, they actually entered Egypt back in the Exodus with 70 people, Jacob, his sons, and their families. Now they're at 600,000 men. That's not even including the women and the children. So that means there's millions of people camped out at this mountain. That sounds crazy. And yet Yahweh's like, I know, but look how many people are here. And not only that, but when you count it, it's not just for the sake of counting, but why are they counting it? Verse 3, if you look at the text, it tells us, all in Israel who are able to go to war. This is an army, which is significant because before, the Israelites, they were slaves in Egypt, making bricks. And now fast forward all the way to Numbers, they are an organized group, no longer slaves in a foreign land, but ready to inherit their own land. So why is this important where Yahweh's like, write this down, read this, New Testament readers, pay attention to this? Why is this significant? God's trying to show Israel and us that his plans and his promises are being fulfilled. Back in Genesis chapter 12, there was a plan that Yahweh gave, that he's going to give to redeem the whole world. It was to one person named Abraham. To Abraham it said, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I'll make you a great nation, and I'll bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. The story of the Bible is God promises to redeem this broken world, and he's going to begin with one person through Abraham, and through his descendants, they're going to be a nation of great blessing. And the problem, though, is when you read that story, there are a lot of obstacles. Abraham, he's old, he's infertile. Even when he has kids, his descendants are sinful and crazy. And then when they actually become large, they get enslaved in Egypt. It looks pretty bad. But the census, the book of Numbers, what it's showing is that through all those obstacles, God is fulfilling his plans. He is fulfilling his promise. And he is emphasizing and reminding the Israelites of what he is doing. And that's what he tells them. Take a census. Before you go into the wilderness, remember that what is happening, how I'm fulfilling this. Because this is what's going to help you trust in God in the wilderness. Because when Israel travels through the wilderness, it's really easy to just see barrenness. This is what the wilderness looks like. Imagine traveling through that. You're just going, you're like, why am I doing this? It's hot. I don't know where I'm going.
what's happening. There's no phone, there's no map. You just feel like you're running in circles. And it can be very easy to think that you're just walking around with no purpose at all. But God wants to remind them before they go on this, hey, just as I was fulfilling my promises and purposes before, I'm fulfilling it even here, right now. Reformed scholar named Ian Duguid, he says it like this, quote, "The census was thus a tangible physical reminder that God had been faithful to the promises he had made to multiply his people and bring them out of Egypt. God had been faithful to his word. The numbers don't lie. Since God had been faithful to his promises in the past, he could be counted on also in the future." This is what the census is for God's people back in Israel. And this is what it's for today as well. As we travel through the wilderness of life, we also need to trust God. And one way we do this is we remember God is a God who's faithful to his plan and to his promises. Because life in the wilderness, it can be discouraging for us. And if we're not careful, all you see is barrenness. Some of you thought you'd work at the same job and build a career through your job. You worked hard, you studied for your MCATs, you went to grad school, you got an internship, residency, and now here you are working in the medical field, and you're just like, this is not what I thought it'd be. Why did I do all that schooling? Some of you changed careers, and you're like, why did I invest all that loans and all that time into a career that I wasn't even going to do later on? Some of you had a relationship that you poured a lot of time into, whether it be a dating relationship or even your marriage, and it's not nearly as happy or fulfilling as you thought it'd be, and you're like, what is that? Why did this happen? Some of you are experiencing setbacks right now where you lost a job, you broke up with your relationship that you thought would lead to marriage, you're struggling with your infertility, you really want a family. And as a result, when you experience this, what's interesting is you're not necessarily depressed, but you're also not like happy. You're in this weird like in-between stage that sociologists call languishing. Have you heard that term before? Languishing, just to define it in modern terms, it is a state where you feel blah about life. It's when you lack enthusiasm or motivation. Or most tellingly, it's when you're grumbling. Oh, life sucks. Oh, my day is okay. You're not sad. You're not happy. You're in this weird in-between stage because you kind of just lost purpose. And you don't know where life is going. Is that you right now? Does that describe the state that you're in? Do you feel more blah than joyful? Do you find yourself grumbling far more than building up and encouraging? Numbers tells us what's happening is you are seeing the barrenness of life. And the barrenness, it's true, it's there. But Numbers is also encouraging us, but see the reality underneath the barrenness, which is God is still doing something. He's fulfilling his plan and his promises in the midst of the wilderness. Romans 8:28 tells us a very explicit promise as followers of Christ. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. A lot of us know this as a cliche Christian verse, but do you believe this? It is something you think is true. Everything happening, God's using it for good. The problem is we don't see this reality often. We don't feel this. And that's where maybe for a lot of us, we need to take a personal census. We need to take into account, what is God doing? You know, for me as a pastor, people sometimes ask, how are you doing? Like, how are you doing as a pastor these days? How's church? And you know, most of the times I'm like, oh, I'm good. You know, when you hear the high-pitched voice, you know, it's like, but it's like, oh, yeah, I'm okay. And because reality is sometimes, if I'm honest, pastoring at a church, it can feel a little discouraging. And the reason why is like, you know, you're preparing a sermon and you preach it, and then you're done, and you're like, And afterwards, it's like, so how was your week? And it's like, okay. You just kind of feel weird, like, what, is anything happening? You're praying all the time for members. I'm always praying for people all the time. And I don't really know how people are doing. You're meeting with people, you're vision casting, you're doing all that. And to be honest, there's some weeks you're like, what's the point? Why are we doing this? Is anything even happening? Like, we're just like busy with our own lives. Like, is anyone changing? Is God even more beautiful to anybody? And I remember actually a few weeks ago, people don't notice, but I felt pretty discouraged actually. There's nothing our church did. It's nothing that happened. It's more like just thinking and ruminating. I'm like, why did I become a pastor? Like, these weird negative thoughts started coming in my brain where I just felt I just saw barrenness. And I remember just kind of being in that weird state. But one thing our church staff and our church elders do is we meet weekly, And one thing we always do before any agenda items is we go, hey, before we start, what's one encouraging thing you see God doing in our church? And without fail, there's always something where someone mentioned, for example, oh, this person, they want to get baptized. I'm just like, oh, I didn't know that. One person shared, our community group, we talked about not just doing the Bible reading plan, we're all going to do it together. Oh, interesting. And one person shared, there's this broken relationship where there's a lot of drama, but they're actually talking about reconciling and meeting together. And when I hear this, I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's just like life to my soul. Because when I see a lot of just dryness and barrenness, there's actually a lot of stuff happening that's kind of my limited perspective does not see. And what I need to do is that's almost functioning like the census for me. Taking time to see, how is God moving? Is he moving? How is this helping us? How is he actually working in this community? And to be honest, that helps me to keep going, to keep saying, hey, let's keep doing this. How about you? Do you see the blessings of God in your life? The way God is working? And if you don't, it might be, maybe you need to take time sometimes to pause, take a personal census, and in the midst of all the craziness and all the barrenness you're seeing, that God, maybe he's still working. It could be once a day. I've been doing this sometimes where not just praying my burdens, but before I close in prayer, what's one thing? I'm like, but God, life sucks, and yet you're doing this right here. Or even maybe your community group or just people like, hey, I don't see God. What's something you guys see? Because you just don't see it. For some of us, what we need to see, what are we thankful for? What are the blessings? What are the struggles that maybe God's working through? Because the story of Numbers tells us if you do that, the numbers don't lie. It will not lie. Because we have a God, Numbers claims, who fulfills his plans and fulfills his promises. If you just take a moment to pause and to see that. That's the first thing we need. Remember the plans of God. Secondly, though, what we need is to centralize the place of God. Numbers chapter 2. So God says, take a census. They're all counting. Okay, but he's not done. Yahweh now goes, okay, don't just take a census, but when you camp somewhere, I have a specific way of how you are meant to camp. And the reason why he's saying this is because Israel, there's millions of them. They're going to pack all their bags, and they're going to be marching to the promised land. And at one point, you got to stop, right? You're just tired. And when you stop, you camp, and I don't know about you, but when I go camping, I'm just like, where's an open spot? And you just camp up, and Yahweh's like, no, don't do that. When you camp, here's a specific way I want you to camp. Look at chapter 2, verse 1 to 2, what he says. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, the people of Israel shall camp by his own standard with the banners of their fathers' houses, and they shall camp facing the tent of meeting on every side. And then we get 32 verses telling us specifically how the camp is to be arranged that we read, and we're just like, what is going on here? Can I give us a TLDR version of what's happening in these 32 verses? What's happening is he's telling you the 12 tribes, okay? The 12 tribes are going to be grouped into groups of 4, 3 tribes in each of these groups of 4, and you're going to be camped around a circle. There's the north side, the east side, the west side, the south side. Inside that camp, what's going to happen is there's this tribe called the group of Levites. And the Levites are not just one group, but there's multiple people in the group of Levites. And all of you're going to camp in the inner circle that's inside the 12 tribes. And right at the center is something called the tent of meeting. Verse 17, the tent of meeting shall set out with the camp of the Levites in the midst of the camps. And as they camp, they shall set out each in position, standard by standard. At the center, the tent of meeting, which if you remember from our series in Leviticus, this is the tent of meeting. This is where the presence of God is there, where all the sacrifices and all the priests approach. Now, if you look at that don't look easy to set up. Nor does that not look easy to tear down. Our church has a setup team led by Daniel Shim. There's a setup team for this back in Israel time. They're called the Levites. They're like the super Daniel Shims. And every time they would camp out, they take down the poles, they take down the curtains, they take down the altars. They're carrying all of it. There's groups of people dedicated to it. And now when they camp out, they have to stop and go, okay, before we do anything, don't just camp out. We need to set this all up. And they're setting it all up in the middle, and then the Levites set up, and then everyone else sets up, and then this is what it's supposed to look like, right here. You have right in the middle the presence of the tabernacle, the presence of God. Around it, those many squares are the different Levites, the Gershonites, the Merarites, the Aaron's house, the Kohathites. And then you have the 12 tribes of Israel in a square like that, each with the banner, the eagle, the lion, the man, the ox, all to represent the tribes. This is a lot of work. This isn't easy. This is not convenient at all. Time to go, wait, pack up the tent, you go. Time to set up, wait, set up the tent. Make sure, hey, Judah, you're there. It's a lot of work. Very inconvenient. Why does God make Israel set up camp this way? It's not because it's efficient. It's not because it's the most simplistic, but it's the most important. Back in the ancient Near East, the center of a nation was the most important part of that nation, which is why for most ancient nations, the center of the nation was a palace, because the king was the most important person in the nation. Israel, they were meant to be different, where at the center of their camp would be the presence of God, which is why even when they became a nation in the temple, it was in the center of Jerusalem, the temple, the presence of God. And that's why every tribe, they camped around in a square so they each had access where they could see the tent of meeting. No one's blocked out. It is perfectly square so they could look at, oh, there's God right there. So when you wake up in the morning and you smell for breakfast, you just see a smoke coming out of the tent of meeting. Like, oh, there's God. When you go to bed as an Israelite, you see fire in a tent of meeting. There's God. When you walk around and you're just hanging out with your friend, there's a tent of meeting. It's right there. You could smell the blood of the animals. You could hear the sacrifices. And every time you hear it and you smell, you go, God is right here in everyday life. This is why God wants to have them set up this way. Why the center, though? Why does God say, I need to be the center of life? Because he knows this is true. Whatever is at the center of life, that will form you. Whatever is right there in the middle, everything else revolves around that, and it shapes you. If your career is at the center of your life, and everything is shaped by your career, you will slowly experience anxiety, self-righteousness, self-condemnation. Maybe not right away, but it just slowly builds into your character because your whole life revolves around your career. Or for some of you, if relationships are at the center of your life, you're going to slowly get built up this desire to please people, this fear of people, reputation. It just becomes a part of your character because it's forming you. Or for some of you, if it's comfort is at the center of your life and everything's shaped to maximize ease and minimize suffering, you become very sensitive. You become someone who can't endure hardships. You become very self-absorbed because it's all about you and who you are. But keep God at the center. If God is in the center of your life and everything's shaped around him, what you experience is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, self-control. And so a quick question for you. What is at the center of your life? What revolves as the center that's shaping everything? You can tell not by what you say, but just look at how you structure your life. Look at the way you structure it. I have a friend back in college. Man, he was into exercising. He would work out all the time, daily routine. He was one of those guys who took a journal and like, what are you writing in there? And he's like, how many times I'm lifting? And it's like, oh, cool, man. Like, he's just like one of those guys. He would, even if it's like raining, he would just drive in the rain and he'll exercise. Finals week, don't matter. He goes and he exercises. Traveling on vacation, he finds a gym wherever he's at because he's devoted to exercise. It's very easy. Exercise was the center of this person's life because everything was structured around his exercise. He was going to exercise no matter what happened. A lot of Christians today say, God is at the center of my life. And yet, when you look at the structure of life, it's very clear he's not. There's something else. Some of you at the center of your life, it is very clear. It's your school. It's your career. Because everything revolves around that. College students, you guys know when the main week collegians are not here on a Sunday? It's finals week. Finals week is like, oh, I don't have time. I don't have time for quiet times. I don't have time for community. Because school is the center of my life. And everything, including God, is going to revolve around that. These are like non-negotiables. For some of us here, maybe that's not school or work, but it's your pleasure. It's your leisure. You work a lot, so you're like, your vacations and your travel times are like really important. I still remember this conversation I had with a person where I was like, hey, see you at church next Sunday? I'm not going to be there. Oh, how come? I'm on vacation. Oh, where are you going? This weekend trip. Oh, you're not going to be at church because you're going on a trip for a weekend? Like, I understand if you're like in overseas, but like you're gone for like to San Diego? And at one point I was feeling kind of cheeky. I'm a pastor, so I'm allowed to say this. I'm like, you should consider coming. You're leaving Friday. You should come back Saturday night so you could come to worship on Sunday. And that person responded by saying, why on earth would I do that? I'm like, oh, and by the way, I get it. I get it. Oh, it's way more inconvenient. Why would you come back Saturday night? Just to worship on Sunday? Who cares? It's no big deal. Because my vacations are really important. Everything revolves around that, including God. Parents, this is a trouble for us, right? Our kids, our Little League schedule, their academics, those are like locked in our calendars, and everything revolves around that. And by the way, as I'm saying all this, I know life is complicated. I'm not saying you better be here every Sunday. Like, I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm trying to point out is a lot of us here, God is not at the center very clearly, because when you look at your life, He revolves around something else. You will gladly move dedicated times with Him for something that actually matters more to you. And this is where you're always trying to correct Israel, where if you really want to be a God-centered community, there's a non-negotiable. I need to be at the center. I need to be at the core. It's very inconvenient. You need a whole setup team to make this work. But that's how important it is as you journey through the wilderness. He has to be central. He has to be viscerally real to you, where He is there and you see Him in all of your schedule and all of your life. And the reason Yahweh is doing this is not just because He wants to do it to make life hard. But what's really fascinating about this passage is, this whole description of the camp, this is not the only time we see this in the Bible. This whole camp, this is a huge theme. It's so boring, and yet you see it everywhere. Most specifically in the prophets, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, they talk about this idea of this camp. And probably just one passage I want to point out is in the book of Revelation. The Apostle John, he sees this vision of a new heaven, new earth, and it's very interesting, his description of the new heavens, new earth. Look what he says. John writes, and around the throne and each side of the throne are 4 living creatures, full of eyes at front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with the face of a man, the fourth living creature like an eagle in flight. That sounds familiar. Well, let's see, an eagle, a lion, a man, and an ox. What is going on here? John is letting us know this is a glimpse of heaven. When God's at the center of your life, that's when you experience what heaven is like. This is what creation's meant to be. This is when you flourish. Creation flourishes when all of creation recognizes God is central. And the new heavens and new earth, the reason why it's flourishing is because God is central. And you, follower of Christ, you can experience the flourishing of life if God would be central. It's not easy. You have to let things go, for sure. But this is new heavens, new earth. This is how creation is meant to be, and this is how you will flourish. If you want there to be love, joy, peace in whatever circumstance you go through, let God be the center of your life. And you can experience that right now. And so, quick question. Is God the center of your life? How can you structure Him? How can you structure your life where He's that way? Just like the Israelites, not easy, but you can do it. You can do it. You might have to rearrange your calendar. You might have to put some non-negotiables. But let His voice and His presence be that consistent anchor in your day-to-day. I know med students, and by the way, if you're a med student, you're like, dude, I'm a med student, I'm in residency, I got time for nothing. We're all like, oh, dude, I don't know what med student means. Like, you do you, man. I know med students, though, there's just one med student I know, so not many, but just one. I know one med student, try really hard, and every day before I go to bed, me and my wife, we try to read the scriptures, because we just need that. When I hear that, I'm like, oh, it's possible. It's very doable, because they're trying to make God as central as possible. I know a young adult, he was in my community group. Man, he worked late hours, like 2 a.m. And he always said, I have to work to 2 a.m. Even today, I have to work to 2 a.m. And as we're in a community group, I'm like, why are you here? And he's like, yeah, I have to go right away back home and work. I'm like, oh, so you're in community group with us, and you're going to go back to work? That's crazy. Most people would be like, I'm busy, I have to work. But his brother is like, no, the community group is important to me. It matters to me. I was like, oh, it's very clear what's central in their life. It's not convenient, but it's clear. I know one person, they got a job offer, ideal job offer, but I didn't take it because it's on Sunday mornings. And again, I can't do that. I can't compromise that. Sundays are just a non-negotiable for me. Or I know one family, like, hey, I have my kids' little leagues on Sundays. Man, what do? We go to worship Saturday because worship is really important to me. I'm going to Japan, Korea, and we're planning the itinerary. I'm like, what should we do this day? What should we do this day? And I remember one question my wife asked me, it was such a buzzkill, was like, so what church should we go to in Japan? And I'm like, oh, like, church? Like, we're flying to Japan. It's a lot of money. We're in Tokyo. Like, how often are we here? It takes like 3 hours to like drive to be in a church service and come back home. It's gonna be a pain in the butt with the kids. They're even speaking Japanese. Like, am I gonna get anything out of this worship service? Like, it's so much easier to be like, I'm gonna wake up and eat sushi because this is our vacation time. How often can I do this? And yeah, it's kind of rebuking for my wife. No, this is central. This is central. And we will revolve everything in our life around what's central, which is God, than having God revolve around everything else. So I'll be at church on Sunday in Japan because this is something where it may not be easy, but we want to keep what's central in our lives. I'm not saying you have to do that, but is God revolving around it, or is your life revolving around God? You can't lie about that. The numbers don't lie. Look at your life and centralize them there. Last thing, and I'll try to make this brief and we'll close. To trust in God, follow the path of God. Notice Numbers chapter 2. Yahweh doesn't say, hey, camp like this. But he tells them, when you leave camp, I want you to go out a certain way. It's very interesting. Look at chapter 2, verse 31. All those listed at the camp of Dan, where do they go? They set out last. You're the last people to go out. Verse 18 of chapter 2. All those listed at the camp of Ephraim, you set out third. Verse 16. All those listed at the camp of Reuben, you go second. Verse 9, all those camp of Judah, go first. You march out first. Very interesting. So here's how they go out. You have the camp of Dan, boom, 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 Ephraim, Reuben, millions of people, but who's always up front? The tribe of Judah. Why is the tribe of Judah the one leading the rest of the tribes through the wilderness and into the promised land? The story of Torah tells us. Genesis chapter 49, verse 10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. It was prophesied hundreds of years ago, that through the tribe of Judah, a king shall come, the Messiah. He's going to come from this tribe, and this tribe, they are going to lead you to the promised land. Follow their lead. Follow where they go, and you will get to that promised land. In other words, Judah is the tribe of Jesus Christ. The tribe of Jesus Christ is going to lead the Israelites through the wilderness into the promised land. Follow his lead. And the same is true for us. Follow Jesus Christ in the path through the wilderness. Let him be in front of you and follow him. And that's how you navigate through the wilderness. And here's the tricky thing. You're going to be led into places that you don't want to go. It's going to be places where you never thought you'd go. God's going to bring you to places like the land of unemployment. And you're like, why am I here? This sucks. You're going to go to the land that's really crazy, the land of breakup, where you're like, why did God end this? You're going to go into the land of infertility, like we're just waiting, like what is happening? You're going to go to the land of divorce, and like, why does this happen in my life? You're going to go into the land of sickness and death. Like, why is there so much loss? And you know what happens when you enter into these lands? We do as human beings, all of us do this. This is a human condition. We try to take control. What do I do to get out of this? How do I fix this? How do I change this? And that is our natural human response when we lead ourselves. If you follow the lead of Jesus, you know what you're going to have to do? Not control, surrender. Learn how to surrender. If Jesus is your lead, that's what he's going to teach you. Surrender in this land of unemployment. You're broken up, surrender here. Surrender in infertility. Surrender in divorce. Surrender in loss. Because when you follow Jesus, the way of Jesus is the way of the cross. Jesus leads you not so that you can have the happiest of life that you think it is. He's leading you to die to yourself. You need to die to the life that you think you want to live so that you can embrace the life that God is calling you to live out. That's what Jesus did for us. He lived a life of surrender all the way to the cross so that we can experience life with him. That's what Israel's called to do, And this is what we're called to do as well. The story of Numbers, it's all about Israel going through the wilderness, Yahweh teaching them to trust him. And you know what's discouraging? Israel fails all the time. They mess up all the time, just like us. We mess up all the time to the point where we want to be done. And yet the bigger theme, even greater than Israel's failure, is Yahweh's faithfulness. He doesn't give up on them. He is gracious, loving, kind, merciful, just, but kind and merciful to them. And same with you as well. Kind, gracious, merciful, failing, and yet he is faithful to you. And so as we take the Lord's Supper, would you consider this? That our God is faithful to us, and we are called to be faithful to him as we journey through this wilderness together. Let me pray for us before we close.